The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley.
Hello everyone and welcome to the program. I'm Matthew Handley and I'm very glad that you're joining me. Over the next several weeks, we'll be journeying through Death Comes for the Archbishop, Willa Cather's beautiful and contemplative novel. The story follows the fictional Archbishop Jean Marie LaTour and his close friend, Father Joseph Phelan, as they work to establish the Diocese of Santa Fe in the rugged and complex landscape of the American Southwest. Now, while this work is a work of fiction, many of the events are inspired by real history, most notably the life of Archbishop Jean-Baptiste Lamy, the first bishop of Santa Fe. Death Comes for the Archbishop was originally published in 1927 and entered the public domain in 2023. If you'd like to read along with me, whether with a physical book or on Kindle, head over to my website, purplecatholic.com. where you can find a link to purchase a special companion edition of this novel. All proceeds from the book sales during the month of July 2025 will be donated to aid to the church in need, so your reading journey can also support a worthy cause. Here's how this program's going to work. Each episode will be split into two parts. First, I'll read a section from the book aloud, then I'll sit down with a guest to reflect on what we've just read, exploring its historical background, spiritual depth, and literary richness. I've got an exciting lineup of guests, historians, priests, teachers, evangelists, all ready to bring fresh insight and engaging conversation to each episode. Thank you for listening to this podcast wherever you found it today. This program is supported by affiliate programs, sponsors, and the paying subscribers of purplecatholic.com. I humbly ask that you use the links in the description to support the program and consider becoming a paying subscriber. Paying subscribers get commercial-free access to the program and get to listen several days earlier. Learn more at purplecatholic.com. In today's first episode, we'll be reading from the prologue through Book 1, Chapter 2. So, without further ado, let's begin Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather.
Prologue. At Rome.
One summer evening in the year 1848, 3 cardinals and a missionary bishop from America were dining together in the gardens of a villa in the Sabine Hills, overlooking Rome. The villa was famous for the fine view from its terrace. The hidden garden in which the 4 men sat at table lay some 20 feet below the south end of this terrace, and was a mere shelf of rock, overhanging a steep declivity planted with vineyards. A flight of stone steps connected it with the promenade above. The table stood above in a sanded square, among potted orange and oleander trees, shaded by spreading ilex oaks that grew out of the rocks overhead. Beyond the balustrade was the drop into the air, and far below the landscape stretched soft and undulating. There was nothing to arrest the eye until it reached Rome itself. It was early when the Spanish cardinal and his guests sat down to dinner. The sun was still good for an hour of supreme splendor, and across the shining folds of country, the low profile of the city barely fretted the skyline, indistinct except for the dome of St. Peter's, bluish-gray like the flattened top of a great balloon, just a flash of copper light on its soft metallic surface. The cardinal had an eccentric preference for beginning his dinner at this time in the late afternoon, when the vehemence of the sun suggested motion. The light was full of action and had a peculiar quality of climax, of splendid finish. It was both intense and soft, with a ruddiness as of much multiplied candlelight, an aura of red in its flames. It bored into the ilex trees, illuminating their mahogany trunks and blurring their dark foliage. It warmed the bright green of the orange trees and the rose of the oleander blooms to gold, sent congested spiral patterns quivering over the damask and plate and crystal. The churchmen kept their rectangular clerical caps on their heads to protect them from the sun. The three cardinals wore black cassocks with crimson pipings and crimson buttons. The bishop, a long black coat over his violet vest. They were talking business, had met, indeed, to discuss an anticipated appeal from the Provincial Council at Baltimore for the founding of an Apostolic Vicariate in New Mexico, a part of North America recently annexed to the United States. This new territory was vague to all of them, even to the missionary bishop. The Italian and French cardinals spoke of it as Le Mexique, and the Spanish host referred to it as New Spain. Their interest in the projected vicariate was tepid and had to be continually revived by the missionary, Father Ferrand, Irish by birth, French by ancestry, a man of wide wanderings and notable achievement in the New World, an Odysseus of the Church. The language spoken was French. The time had already gone by when cardinals could conveniently discuss contemporary matters in Latin. The French and Italian cardinals were men in vigorous middle life. The Norman full-belted and ruddy, the Venetian spare and sallow and hook-nosed. Their host, Garcia Maria de Allende, was still a young man. He was dark in coloring, but the long Spanish face that looked out from so many canvases in his ancestral portrait gallery was in the young cardinal much modified through his English mother. With his café oscuro eyes, he had a fresh, pleasant English mouth and an open manner. During the latter years of the reign of Gregory XVI, de Allende had been the most influential man at the Vatican, but since the death of Gregory 2 years ago, he had retired to his country estate. He believed the reforms of the new pontiff impractical and dangerous, and had withdrawn from politics, confining his activities to the work for the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, that organization which had been so fostered by Gregory. In his leisure, the cardinal played tennis. As a boy in England, he had been passionately fond of this sport. Lawn tennis had not yet come into fashion. It was a formidable game of indoor tennis the cardinal played. The amateurs of that violent sport came from Spain and France to try their skill against him. The missionary, Bishop Ferrand, looked much older than any of them, old and rough, except for his clear, intensely blue eyes. His diocese lay within the icy arms of the Great Lakes, and on his long, lonely horseback rides among his missions, the sharp winds had bitten him well. The missionary was here for a purpose, and he pressed his point. He ate more rapidly than the others and had plenty of time to plead his cause. Finish each course with such dispatch that the Frenchman remarked he would have been an ideal dinner companion for Napoleon. The bishop laughed and threw out his brown hands in apology. "Likely enough, I have forgotten my manners. I am preoccupied. Here you can scarcely understand what it means that the United States has annexed that enormous territory which was the cradle of faith in the New World. The Vicariate of New Mexico will be in a few years raised to an episcopal see, with jurisdiction over a country larger than Central and Western Europe, barring Russia. The bishop of that see will direct the beginning of momentous things." "Beginnings," murmured the Venetian. "There have been so many. But nothing ever comes from over there but trouble and appeals for money." The missionary turned to him patiently. "Your Eminence, I beg you to follow me. This country was evangelized in 1500 by the Franciscan Fathers. It has been allowed to drift for nearly 300 years, and it is not yet dead. It still pitifully calls itself a Catholic country and tries to keep the forms of religion without instruction. The old mission churches are in ruins, the priests are without guidance or discipline, they're lax in religious observance, and some of them live in open concubinage. If this Augean stable is not cleansed, now that the territory has been taken over by a progressive government, it will prejudice the interests of the Church in the whole of North America. But these missions are still under the jurisdiction of Mexico, are they not? Inquired the Frenchman. In the see of the Bishop of Durango, added Maria de Allende. The missionary sighed. Your Eminence, the Bishop of Durango is an old man, and from his seat to Santa Fe is a distance of 1,500 English miles. There are no wagon roads, no canals, no navigable rivers. Trade is carried out by means of pack mules over treacherous trails. The desert down there has a peculiar horror. I do not mean thirst, nor Indian massacres, which are quite frequent. The very floor of the world is cracked open into countless canyons and arroyos, fissures in the earth, which are sometimes 10 feet deep, sometimes 1,000. Up and down these stony chasms the traveler and his mules clamber as best they can. It is impossible to go far in any direction without crossing them. If the Bishop of Durango should summon a disobedient priest by letter, who shall bring the padre to him? Who can prove that he ever received the summons? The post is carried by hunters, fur trappers, gold seekers, whoever happens to be moving on the trails. The Norman cardinal emptied his glass and wiped his lips. And the inhabitants, Father Ferrand, if these are travelers, who stays at home? Some 30 Indian nations, Monsignor, each with its own customs and language, many of them fiercely hostile to each other. And the Mexicans, a naturally devout people, untaught and unshepherded, they cling to the faith of their fathers. I have a letter from the Bishop of Durango recommending his vicar for this new post, remarked Maria de Allende. Your Eminence, it would be a great misfortune if a native priest were appointed. They have never done well in that field. Besides, this vicar is old. The new vicar must be a young man of strong constitution, full of zeal, and above all intelligent. He will have to deal with savagery and ignorance, with dissolute priests and political intrigue. He must be a man to whom order is necessary, as dear as life. The Spaniard's coffee-colored eyes showed a glint of yellow as he glanced sidewise at his guest. I suspect from your exordium that you have a candidate, and that he is a French priest, perhaps. You guessed rightly, Monsignor. I am glad to see that we have the same opinion of French missionaries. Yes, said the cardinal lightly, they are the best missionaries. Our Spanish fathers made good martyrs, but the French Jesuits accomplished more. They are great organizers. Better than the Germans? Asked the Venetian, who had Austrian sympathies. Oh, the Germans classify, but the French arrange. The French missionaries have a sense of proportion and rational adjustment. They are always trying to discover the logical relation of things. It is a passion with them. Here the host turned to the old bishop again. But your grace, why do you neglect this Burgundy? I had this wine brought up from my cellar especially to warm away the chill of your 20 Canadian winters. Surely you do not gather vintages like this on the shores of the Great Lake Huron. The missionary smiled as he took up his untouched glass. It is superb, Your Eminence, but I fear that I have lost my palate for vintages. Out there, a little whiskey or Hudson Bay Company run does better for us. I must confess I enjoyed the champagne in Paris. We had been 40 days at sea, and I am a poor sailor. Then we must have some for you, he made a sign to his major domo. You like it very cold? And your new Vicar Apostolic, what will he drink in the company of bison and serpent à sonnet? And what will he eat? He will eat dried buffalo meat and frijoles with chili, and he will be glad to drink water when he can get it. He will have no easy life, Your Eminence. That country will drink up his youth and strength as it does the rain. He will be called upon for every sacrifice, quite possibly for martyrdom. Only last year, the Indian pueblo of San Fernandez de Taos murdered and scalped the American governor and some dozen other whites. The reason they did not scalp their padre was that their padre was one of the leaders of the rebellion and himself planned the massacre. That is how things stand in New Mexico. Where is your candidate at present, Father? He's a parish priest on the shores of Lake Ontario in my diocese. I have watched his work for 9 years. He's but 35 now. He came to us directly from the seminary. And his name is? Jean Marie LaTour. Maria de Alon, leaning back in his chair, put the tips of his long fingers together and regarded them thoughtfully. Of course, Father Ferrand, the propaganda would almost certainly appoint to this vicariate the man whom the council at Baltimore recommends. Yes, Your Eminence, but a word from you to the provincial council, an inquiry, a suggestion, might have some weight, I admit, replied the cardinal, smiling. And this LaTour is intelligent, you say? What a fate you are drawing upon him! But I suppose it is no worse than a life among the Hurons. My knowledge of your country is chiefly drawn from the romances of Fenimore Cooper, which I read in English with great pleasure. But has your priest a versatile intelligence? Any intelligence in matters of art, for example? And what need would he have of that, Monseigneur? Besides, he is from Auvergne. The three cardinals broke into laughter and refilled their glasses. They were all becoming restive under the monotonous persistence of their missionary. Listen, said the host, and I will relate a little story, while the bishop does me the compliment to drink my champagne. I have a reason for asking this question, which you have answered so finally. In my family house in Valencia, I have a number of pictures by the great Spanish painters, collected chiefly by my great-grandfather, who is a man of perception in these things, and, for his time, rich. His collection of El Greco is, I believe, quite the best in Spain. When my progenitor was an old man, along came one of these missionary priests from New Spain, begging. All missionaries from the Americas were inveterate beggars, then as now, Bishop Ferrand. This Franciscan had considerable success with his tales of pious Indian converts and struggling missions. He came to visit at my great-grandfather's house and conducted devotions in the absence of the chaplain. He willed a good sum of money out of the old man, as well as the vestments and linens and chalices. He would take anything, and he implored my grandfather to give him a painting from his collection for the ornamentation of his mission church among the Indians. My grandfather told him to choose from the gallery, believing the priest would covet most what he himself could best afford to spare. But not at all. The hairy Franciscan pounced upon one of the best in the collection, a young St. Francis in meditation, by El Greco, and the model for the saint was one of the very handsome Dukes of Albuquerque. My grandfather protested, tried to persuade the fellow that some picture of the crucifixion or a martyrdom would appeal more strongly to his redskins. What would a St. Francis, of almost feminine beauty, mean to their scalp-takers? All in vain. The missionary turned upon his host with a reply which had become a saying in our family. You refuse me this picture because it is a good picture. It is too good for God, but it is not too good for you. He carried off the painting. In my grandfather's manuscript catalogue, under the number and title of the St. Francis, it is written, Given to Fray Teodosio, for the glory of God, to enrich his mission church at Puebla de Silla among the savages of New Spain. It is because of this lost treasure, Father Ferrand, that I happen to have some personal correspondence with the Bishop of Durango. I once wrote the facts to him fully. He replied to me that the mission at Silla was long ago destroyed and its furnishings scattered. Of course, the painting may have been ruined in a pillage or massacre, but on the other hand, it may still be hidden away in some crumbling sacristy or smoky wigwam. If your French priest had a discerning eye now and were sent to this vicariate, he might keep my El Greco in mind. The bishop shook his head. No, I can't promise you. I do not know. I've noticed that he is a man of severe and refined taste, but he is very reserved. And down there the Indians do not dwell in wigwams, Your Eminence, he added gently. No matter, Father. I see your redskins through Fenimore Cooper, and I like them so. Now, let us go to the terrace for our coffee, and watch the evening come on. The cardinal led his guests up the narrow stairway. The long gravelled terrace and its balustrade were blue as a lake in the dusky air. Both sun and shadows were gone. The folds of russet country were now violet. Waves of rose and gold throbbed up from the sky from behind the dome of the basilica. As the churchmen walked up and down the promenade, watching the stars come out, their talk touched upon many matters, but they avoided politics, as men are apt to do in dangerous times. Not a word was spoken of the Lombard War, in which the Pope's position was so anomalous. They talked instead of a new opera by young Verdi, which was being sung in Venice. of the case of a Spanish dancing girl who had lately become a religious and was said to be working miracles in Andalusia. In this conversation, the missionary took no part, nor could he even follow it with much interest. He asked himself whether he had been on the frontier so long that he had quite lost his taste for the talk of clever men. But before they separated for the night, Maria de Alan spoke a word in his ear in English. "You are distrait, Father Ferrand. Are you wishing to unmake your new bishop already? It is too late. Jean Marie LaTour, am I right?"
Book 1, The Vicar, Apostolic. Chapter 1, The Cruciform Tree.
One afternoon in the autumn of 1851, a solitary horseman, followed by a pack mule, was pushing through an arid stretch of country somewhere in central New Mexico. He had lost his way and was trying to get back to the trail, with only his compass and his sense of direction for guides. The difficulty was that country in which he found himself was so featureless, or rather, that it was crowded with features, all exactly alike. As far as he could see on every side, the landscape was heaped up into monotonous red sandhills, not much larger than haycocks, and very much the shape of haycocks. One could not have believed that in the number of square miles a man is able to sweep with the eye, there could be so many uniform red hills. He had been riding among them since early morning, and the look of the country had no more changed than if he had stood still. He must have traveled nearly 30 miles of those conical red hills, winding his way in the narrow cracks between them, and he had begun to think that he would never see anything else. They were so exactly like one another that he seemed to be wandering in some geometrical nightmare. Flattened cones they were, more the shape of Mexican ovens than haycocks. Yes, exactly the shape of Mexican ovens. Red as brick dust, and naked of vegetation except for small juniper trees. And the junipers, too, were the shape of Mexican ovens. Every conical hill was spotted with smaller cones of juniper, a uniform yellowish green, as the hills were a uniform red. The hills thrust out of the ground so thickly that they seemed to be pushing each other, elbowing each other aside, tipping each other over. The blunted pyramid, repeated so many hundred times upon his retina and crowning down upon him in the heat, had confused the traveler, who was sensitive to the shape of things. "Mais c'est fantastique," he muttered, closing his eyes to rest them from the intrusive omnipresence of the triangle. When he opened his eyes again, his glance immediately fell upon one juniper, which differed in shape from the others. It was not a thick-growing cone, but a naked, twisted trunk, perhaps 10 feet high, and at the top it parted into 2 lateral, flat-lying branches, with a little crest of green in the center, just above the cleavage. Living vegetation could not present more faithfully the form of the cross. The traveler dismounted, drew from his pocket a much-worn book, and bearing his head knelt at the foot of the cruciform tree. Under his buckskin riding coat he wore a black vest, and the cravat and collar of a churchman, a young priest at his devotions, and a priest in 1,000 one knew at a glance. His bowed head was not that of an ordinary man, it was built for the seat of a fine intelligence. His brow was open, generous, reflective, his features handsome and somewhat severe. There was a singular elegance about the hands below the fringed cuffs of the buckskin jacket. Everything showed him to be the man of gentle birth, brave, sensitive, courteous. His manners, even when he was alone in the desert, were distinguished. He had a kind of courtesy toward himself, toward his beasts, toward the juniper tree before which he knelt, and the God whom he was addressing. His devotions lasted perhaps half an hour, and when he rose he looked refreshed. He began talking to his mare in halting Spanish, asking whether she agreed with him that it would be better to push on, weary as she was, in hope of finding the trail. He had no water left in his canteen, and the horses had none since yesterday morning. They had made a dry camp in these hills last night, The animals were almost at the end of their endurance, but they would not recuperate until they got water, and it seemed best to spend their last strength in searching for it. On a long caravan trip across Texas, this man had some experience of thirst, as the party with which he traveled was several times put on a meager water ration for days together. He had not suffered then as he did now. Since morning he had the feeling of illness, a taste of fever in his mouth, and alarming seizures of vertigo. As these conical hills pressed closer and closer upon him, he began to wonder whether his long wayfaring from the mountains of Auvergne were possibly to end here. He reminded himself of that cry wrung from his Savior on the cross, "J'ai soif." Of all the Lord's physical sufferings, only one, "I thirst," rose to his lips. Empowered by long training, the young priest blotted himself out of his own consciousness and meditated upon the anguish of his Lord. The passion of Jesus became for him the only reality. The need of his own body was but a part of that conception. His mare stumbled, breaking his mood of contemplation. He was sorrier for his beasts than for himself. He supposed to be the intelligence of the party. He had got the poor animals into this interminable desert of ovens. He was afraid he had been absent-minded, had been pondering his problem instead of heeding the way. His problem was how to recover a bishopric. He was a vicar apostolic, lacking a vicariate. He was thrust out. His flock would have none of him. The traveler was Jean Marie LaTour, consecrated vicar apostolic of New Mexico and bishop of Agathonica in Partibus at Cincinnati a year ago, and ever since then he had been trying to reach his vicariate. No one in Cincinnati could tell him how to get to New Mexico. No one had ever been there. Since young Father LaTour's arrival in America, a railroad had been built from New York to Cincinnati, but there it ended. New Mexico lay in the middle of a dark continent. The Ohio merchants knew of two routes only. One was the Santa Fe Trail from St. Louis, but at that time it was very dangerous because of the Comanche Indian raids. His friends advised Father LaTour to go down the river to New Orleans, thence by boat to Galveston, across Texas to San Antonio, and to wind up in New Mexico along the Rio Grande Valley. This he had done, but with what misadventures! His steamer was wrecked and sunk in the Galveston harbor, and he had lost all his worldly possessions except his books, which he saved at the risk of his life. He crossed Texas with a trader's caravan, and approaching San Antonio, he was hurt in jumping from an overturning wagon and had to lie for 3 months in the crowded house of a poor Irish family, waiting for his injured leg to get strong. It was nearly a year after he had embarked upon the Mississippi that the young bishop, at about the sunset hour of a summer afternoon, at last beheld the old settlement toward which he had been journeying so long. The wagon train had been going all day through a greasewood plain, when late in the afternoon the teamsters began shouting that over yonder was the villa. Across the level, Father LaTour could distinguish low brown shapes, like earthworks, lying at the base of wrinkled green mountains with bare tops. Wave-like mountains, resembling billows beaten up from a flat sea by a heavy gale, and their green was of two colors, aspen and evergreen, not intermingled, but lying in solid areas of light and dark. As the wagons went forth and the sun sank lower, a sweep of red carnelian-colored hills lying at the foot of the mountains came into view. They curved like two arms about a depression in the plain, and in that depression was Santa Fe, at last. A thin, wavering adobe town, a green plaza, at one end a church, with two earthen towers that rose high above the flatness. The long main street began at the church. The town seemed to flow from it like a stream from a spring. The church towers, and all the low adobe houses, were rose-color in that light, a little darker in tone than the amphitheater of the red hills beyond, and periodically the plumes of poplars flashed like gracious accent marks, inclining and recovering themselves in the wind. The young bishop was not alone in the exaltation of that hour. Beside him rode Father Joseph Vaillant, his boyhood friend, who had made this long pilgrimage with him and shared his dangers. The two rode into Santa Fe together, claiming it for the glory of God. How then had Father LaTour come to be here in the sand hills, many miles from his seat, unattended, far out of his way, and with no knowledge of how to get back to it? Upon his arrival at Santa Fe, this is what happened. The Mexican priests there had refused to recognize his authority. They disclaimed any knowledge of a vicariate apostolic or a bishop of Agathonica. They said they were under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Durango and had received no instructions to the contrary. If Father LaTour was to be their bishop, where were his credentials? A parchment and letters he knew had been sent to the Bishop of Durango, but these evidently got no further. There was no postal service in this part of the world. The quickest and surest way to communicate with the Bishop of Durango was to go to him. So having traveled for nearly a year to reach Santa Fe, Father LaTour left it after a few weeks and set off alone on horseback to ride down into Old Mexico and back, a journey of full 3,000 miles. He had been warned that there were many trails leading off the Rio Grande Road and that a stranger might easily mistake his way. For the first few days he had been cautious and watchful. Then he must have grown careless and turned into some purely local trail. When he realized that he was astray, his canteen was already empty, and his horses seemed too exhausted to retrace their steps. He had persevered in this sandy track which grew ever fainter, reasoning that it must lead somewhere. All at once, Father LaTour thought he felt a change in the body of his mare. She lifted her head for the first time in a long while, and seemed to redistribute her weight upon her legs. The pack mule behaved in a similar manner, and both quickened their pace. Was it possible they scented water? Nearly an hour went by, and then, winding between two hills that were like all the hundreds that had passed, the two beasts whinnied simultaneously. Below them, in the midst of that wavy ocean of sand, was a green thread of verdure and a running stream. This ribbon in the desert seemed no wider than a man could throw a stone, and it was greener than anything LaTour had ever seen, even his own greenest corner of the old world. But for the quivering of the hide on his mare's neck and shoulders, he might have thought this a vision, a delusion of thirst. Running water, clover fields, cottonwoods, acacias, little adobe houses with brilliant gardens, a boy driving a flock of white goats toward the stream. That is what the young bishop saw. A few moments later, when he was struggling with his horses, trying to keep them from overdrinking, a young girl with a black shawl over her head came running toward him. He thought he had never seen a kindlier face. Her greeting was that of a Christian. "Ave Maria Purissima, Señor, whence do you come?" "Blessed child," he replied in Spanish, "I am a priest who has lost his way. I am famished for water." "A priest?" she cried. "That is not possible. Yet I look at you and it is true. Such a thing has never happened to us before. It must be an answer to my father's prayers. Run, Pedro, and tell Father and Salvatore." Coming up,
in the contemplative nature of LaTour and the more active, vibrant, even sanguine nature of Roland, you and I see those facets of our own life. Now, these were real people, and so we get to immerse sacramentally into their life, but in a more expansive way, we develop a moral imagination to sacramentalize the world that we live in now.
Now this.
Support for this program comes from NordVPN, a provider of virtual private network services. NordVPN offers tools designed to encrypt internet traffic and route connections through remote servers, helping to enhance online privacy and reduce digital tracking. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/NordVPN and by Expedia, an online travel service offering booking options for flights, hotels, rental cars, and vacation packages. Expedia provides tools to compare and book accommodations, transportation, and activities with a wide selection of options available. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/Expedia.
If you're ready to take your email marketing to the next level, check out Moosin, the all-in-one platform trusted by over 100,000 businesses. With drag-and-drop editing, over 75 mobile-ready templates, and smart automation tools, you can easily create campaigns that convert. Need to personalize? Moosin's got real-time segmentation, dynamic content, and even weather-based triggers. Plus, their built-in AI assistant helps you write killer subject lines and email copy that actually gets clicks. And the best part? You can try it free for 30 days. No credit card needed. Head to trymoo.moosin.com/purple. That's trymoosend.com/purple and start sending smarter emails today.
Let's pick up where we left off now on Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Chapter 2. Hidden Water.
An hour later, as darkness came over the sand hills, the young bishop was seated at supper in the mother house of this Mexican settlement, which he learned was appropriately called Agua Secreta, hidden water. At the table with him were his host, an old man called Benito, his oldest son, and 2 grandsons. The old man was a widower, and his daughter, Josefa, the girl who had run to meet the bishop at the stream, was his housekeeper. Their supper was a pot of frijoles cooked with meat, bread and goat's milk, fresh cheese, and ripe apples. From the moment he entered this room with its thick whitewashed adobe walls, Father LaTour had felt a kind of peace about it. In its bareness and simplicity there was something comely, as there was about the serious girl who had placed their food before them and who now stood in the shadows against the wall, her eager eyes fixed upon his face. He found himself very much at home with the 4 dark-headed men who sat beside him in the candlelight. Their manners were gentle, their voices low and agreeable. When he said grace before the meal, the men had knelt on the floor beside the table. The grandfather declared that the Blessed Virgin must have led the bishop from his path and brought him here to baptize the children and to sanctify the marriages. Their settlement was little known, he said. They had no papers for their land, and were afraid the Americans might take it away from them. There was no one in their settlement who could read or write. Salvatore, his oldest son, had gone all the way to Albuquerque to find a wife, and had married there. But the priest had charged him 20 pesos, and that was half of all he had saved to buy furniture and glass windows for his house. His brothers and cousins, discouraged by his experience, had taken wives without the marriage sacrament. In an answer to the bishop's questions, they told him the simple story of their lives. They had all they needed to make them happy. They spun and wove from the fleece of their flocks, raised their own corn and wheat and tobacco, dried their plums and apricots for winter. Once a year the boys took the grain up to Albuquerque to have it ground, and brought such luxuries as sugar and coffee. They had bees, and when sugar was high they sweetened with honey. Benito did not know in what year his grandfather had settled there, coming from Chihuahua with all his goods in ox carts. But it was soon after the time when the French killed their king. My grandfather had heard them talk of that before he left home, and used to tell us boys about it when he was an old man. "Perhaps you have guessed that I am a Frenchman," said Father LaTour. No, they had not, but they had felt sure that he was not an American. Jose, the eldest grandson, had been watching the visitor uncertainly. He was a handsome boy, with a triangle of black hair hanging over his rather sullen eyes. He now spoke for the first time. "They say at Albuquerque that now we are all Americans, but that is not true, Padre. I will never be an American. They are infidels." "Not all, my son. I have lived among Americans in the North for 10 years, and I have found many devout Catholics." The young man shook his head. "They destroyed our churches when they were fighting us and stabled their horses in them, and now they will take our religion away from us. We want our own ways and our own religion." Father LaTour began to tell them about his friendly relations with Protestants in Ohio, but they had not room in their minds for 2 ideas. There was one church, and the rest of the world was infidel. One thing they could understand, that he had here in his saddlebags his vestments, the altar stone, and all the equipment for celebrating the Mass, and that tomorrow morning after Mass he would hear confessions, baptize, and sanctify marriages. After supper, Father LaTour took up a candle and began to examine the holy images on the shelf over the fireplace. The wooden figures of the saints, found even in the poorest Mexican houses, always interested him. He had never yet seen 2 alike. These over Benito's fireplace had come in the ox carts from Chihuahua nearly 60 years ago. They had been carved by some devout soul and brightly painted that the colors had softened with time, and they were dressed in cloth like dolls. They were much more to his taste than the factory-made plaster images in his mission church in Ohio, more like the homely stone carvings on the front of old parish churches in Auvergne. The wooden Virgin was a sorrowing mother indeed, long and stiff and severe, very long from the neck to the waist, and even longer from waist to feet, like some of the rigid mosaics of the Eastern Church. She was dressed in black with a white apron and a black rebozo over her head, like a Mexican woman of the poor. At her right was St. Joseph, and at her left a fierce little equestrian figure, a saint wearing the costume of a Mexican ranchero, velvet trousers richly embroidered and wide at the ankle, velvet jacket and silk shirt, and a high-crowned, broad-brimmed Mexican sombrero. He was attached to his fat horse by a wooden pivot driven through the saddle. The younger grandson saw the priest's interest in the figure. "That," he said, "is my name-saint, Santiago." "Oh, yes, Santiago. He was a missionary like me. In our country we call him Saint Jacques, and he carries a staff and a wallet. But here he would need a horse, surely." The boy looked at him in surprise. "But he is the saint of horses. Isn't he that in your country?" The bishop shook his head. "No, I know nothing about that. How is he the saint of horses?" "He blesses the mares and makes them fruitful. Even the Indians believe that. They know that if they neglect to pray to Santiago for a few years, the foals do not come right." A little later, after his devotions, the young bishop lay down in Benito's deep feather bed, thinking how different was this night from the anticipation of it. He had expected to make a dry camp in the wilderness and to sleep under a juniper tree, like the prophet, tormented by thirst. But here he lay in comfort and safety, with love for his fellow creatures flowing like peace about his heart. If Father Vaillant was here, he would say a miracle, that the Holy Mother to whom he had addressed himself before the cruciform tree had led him hither. And it was a miracle. Father LaTour knew that. But his dear Joseph must always have the miracle very direct and spectacular, not with nature, but against it. He would almost be able to tell the color of the mantle Our Lady wore when she took the mare by the bridle back yonder among the junipers and led her out of the pathless sandhills, as the angel led the ass on the flight into Egypt. In the late afternoon of the following day, the bishop was walking alone along the banks of the life-giving stream, reviewing in his mind the events of the morning. Benito and his daughter had made an altar before the sorrowful wooden Virgin, and placed upon it candles and flowers. Every soul in the village, except Salvatore's sick wife, had come to the Mass. He had performed marriages and baptisms and heard confessions and confirmed until noon. Then came the christening feast. Jose had killed a kid the night before, and immediately after her confirmation, Josefa slipped away to help her sisters-in-law roast it. When Father LaTour asked her to give him his portion without chili, the girl inquired whether it was more pious to eat it like that. He hastened to explain that Frenchmen as a rule do not like high seasoning, lest she should hereafter deprive herself of her favorite condiment. After the feast, the sleepy children were taken home. The men gathered in the plaza to smoke under their great cottonwood trees. The bishop, feeling in need of solitude, had gone forth to walk, firmly refusing an escort. On his way, he passed the earthen thrashing floor, where these people beat out their grain and winnowed it in the wind, like the children of Israel. He heard a frantic bleating behind him, and was overtaken by Pedro with the great flock of goats, indignant at their day's confinement, and wild to be in the fringe pasture along the hills. They leaped the stream like arrows speeding from the bow, and regarding the bishop as they passed him with their mocking, humanly intelligent smile. The young bucks were light and elegant in figure, with their pointed chins and polished tilted horns. There was great variety in their faces, but in nearly all something supercilious and sardonic. The Angoras had long silky hair of a dazzling whiteness. As they leaped through the sunlight, they brought to mind the chapter in the Apocalypse about the whiteness of them that were washed in the blood of the Lamb. The young bishop smiled at his mixed theology, but though the goat had always been the symbol of pagan lewdness, he told himself that their fleece had warmed many a good Christian, and their rich milk nourished sickly children. About a mile above the village he came upon the waterhead, a spring overhung by the sharp-leafed variety of cottonwood called water willow. All about it crowded the oven-shaped hills, nothing to hint of water until it rose miraculously out of the parched and thirsty sea of sand. Some subterranean stream found an outlet here and was relieved from darkness. The result was grass and trees and flowers and human life, household order and hearths from which the smoke of burning piñon logs rose like incense to heaven. The bishop sat for a long time by the spring, with the declining sun pouring its beautifying light over those low, rose-tinted houses and bright gardens. The old grandfather had shown him his arrowheads and corroded medals, a sword-hilt, evidently Spanish, that he had found in the earth near the waterhead. This spot had been a refuge for humanity long before these Mexicans had come upon it. It was older than history, like those wellheads in his own country where the Roman settlers had set up the image of a river goddess, and later the Christian priests had planted a cross. The settlement was his bishopric in miniature, hundreds of square miles of thirsty desert, then a spring, a village, old men trying to remember their catechism and to teach their grandchildren. The faith planted by the Spanish friars and watered with their blood was not dead. It awaited the toil of the husbandman. He was not troubled about the revolt at Santa Fe, or the powerful old native priest who led it, Father Martinez of Taos, who had ridden over from his parish expressly to receive the new vicar and to drive him away. He was rather terrifying, that old priest, with his big head, violent Spanish face, and shoulders like a buffalo. But the day of his tyranny was almost over. As Bishop LaTour travels through Old Mexico, we're going to take a step back and discuss the importance of reading literature with my friend Dr. Marcus Peter. He's the director of theology for Ave Maria Radio and the Cresta Institute. He's also the radio host of the daily EWTN drive time program, Ave Maria in the Afternoon. He's the television host of Unveiling the Covenants and is a prolific author, biblical theologian, cultural commentator, and international speaker. You can follow more of his work at marcusbpeter.com. Marcus, good to talk to you. Thanks for joining me.
Always a joy, my friend. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. I immediately thought of you as I was working on this because of the skill that I see that you have in being able to reach people, not unlike our late mutual friend Al Cresta. You have a knack of being able to really get down to the nitty-gritty of things without making it sound overcomplicated. And I think that's a real gift, particularly when it comes to preaching. So I'm glad you're able to join me and we can have this conversation. I want to talk kind of and zone it in a little bit on literature, because I know you are necessarily an academic. You've got your ThD and you're the director of theology at Ave Maria Radio. I wrote in the introduction to the companion of this that sometimes those of us that are already devout Catholics, that we want to learn more about the church, we immediately go towards the Summa or in other documents like that, which are good and worthy to read. But Pope Francis wrote in a letter back in 2024 to seminarians that literature can help guide us as well. It can show us what other experiences are like. Things that we might not normally see in our everyday lives. You can experience the pain of perhaps a mother losing her child, even though you and I will never have that experience of being a mother through the act of literature. Do you use literature in preaching, and how useful of a tool do you think literature can be in preaching?
Tremendously important. And I want to start with a humble confession. Because my study into the faith was autodidactic, I didn't have a proper systematic immersion in Western thought. And Western thought must include the heritage of the great books. It's inseparable. Mm-hmm. The philosophical and theological underpinnings of Western thought came to full flourishing in its literary and artistic prowess. And so in that sense, art and literature, music, they become overflows of the good that is already pre-existent in the culture by means of thinking rightly and believing and worshiping rightly. Now, as I say this, there's different degrees of literature. So you've got some of your high imagery. You've got Dante's Divine Comedy. Yep. I would put Tolkien's Lord of the Rings right up there. And some might argue that it's a little lower, and I can respect that. You can go a little lower than that into Lewis's Narnia series or Perelandra, and any one of the even non-Christian systems of literature, so the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid. And in all of this, what do you wind up seeing? You see an expansive development of the human imagination to contemplate those things that are true, good, and beautiful. The work of literature, the work of this, I call it the study of literature. The truth is, it's different than the study of theology. In the study of theology, you're actively forming your soul to think rightly, that you may believe and live rightly. When you're reading literature, the point is, every book you're reading, if it's written rightly, like this one, Death Comes for the Archbishop, it's the story of the everyman, which means both Archbishop, gosh, I'm blanking on their names,
LaTour,
LaTour and Valant, their story is our story. And so in the contemplative nature of LaTour and the more active, vibrant, even sanguine nature of Valant, you and I see those facets of our own life. Now, these were real people, and so we get to immerse sacramentally into their life. But in a more expansive way, we develop a moral imagination to sacramentalize the world that we live in now, so that all of a sudden, my stepping out in nature and seeing the order and the beauty of trees and grass and dirt and animals is a reflection of the love that God has in order of the entire created world. And reading literature gives you that. It does that for you. And so I appeal to literary works a lot in not just the way I think, but also the way I teach and preach. But I also want to start with humility. The person who inducted me into this was my bride over COVID, because she didn't want me to keep reading theology because I read so much, because, we were sequestered at home. They didn't use the word sequestered. What did they call it again? Locked in?
Lockdown.
Lockdown.
Something weird like that.
Yeah, and so she knew that I was reading too much theology, and my brain was just a little too wired at night. I wasn't sleeping. So she got me into The Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. And from there I picked up Dante, and I've never looked back. Now, mind you, this was only, 5 years ago now. And it's completely transformed the organic way I teach, because there's an aesthetic reality that literary artists are able to do that you and I can be formed into. We need to learn to develop that capacity. And that's why children flourish with literature. You give them imagination. As Chesterton says, we don't tell children stories about knights and dragons because we want to convince them dragons are real. They already know that. We teach them these stories so that they know dragons can be slain. Mm-hmm. That's what literature does.
Do you have any, you mentioned Lord of the Rings and Narnia, and you also mentioned the Italian writer Dante. Mm-hmm. Do you have any particular ones that you point to the most, that you have any favorites of when you're doing your preaching?
I have to be very humbly honest. I think Tolkien would be the one I appeal to most of all. I have consumed his corpus. It's come to a point where the interpenetrating themes are so profound that it's almost alarming to think that this was all contained in one man's mind and then eventually put forth on paper. It's absurd. Nothing short of grace, I think, allowed him to do that. So, very honestly, I think Tolkien's corpus is what compels me the most in terms of literary works. But if we're looking at classics, I read a tremendous amount of Shakespeare. I appeal to that a lot. A lot of the British female authors I don't appeal to as much, even though I see their brilliance. So, like Austen and the Bronte sisters. There's a tremendous amount of merit from all of these authors as well.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, for joining me on the program. I appreciate it.
Matthew, a real joy as always. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course. Next week, Bishop LaTour hears the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe for the first time, and Father Bob Keller joins me to discuss the practice of preaching. I'm Matthew Handley. Lord willing, I will talk to you then. Goodbye.
Special thanks to our broadcast partners, Ave Maria Radio and Epic Radio 103.5 FM. The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley. Copyright 2025 M.H. Media Ventures, LLC. All rights reserved. For more, visit purplecatholic.com.